What's up, guys? This is Joe from Just Ball Analytics. I'm joined today by JM from the Hardline Sports Talk. What's going on, JM?
Nothing much, man. Pretty familiar with you.
Yeah,
That's-
yeah. I would say that, we got some similar blood coursing through our
Yeah,
veins.
yeah. Who knows?
Yeah, what are you going to do? All right. So, in today's segment, we are going to be discussing who we believe are the most underrated and most overrated players from the three major sports, that being the NFL, the MLB, and the NBA. So, I'll get us started. We'll start off with the NFL. I believe that the current most underrated player in football is 49ers cornerback Charvarius Ward. Now, everybody knows how great the 49ers defense was this season, arguably one of the better defenses that we've seen in the last couple of years. A lot of people talk about the same names on that defense, whether it be Nick Bosa, Fred Warner. There's a lot of big names that a lot of people like to talk about from that team, but one guy that I think really doesn't get his due is Charvarius Ward. Charvarius Ward, honestly, was one of the best corners in all of football this season, and yet you really never heard his name. He had the 10th best reception percentage allowed amongst all corners in the NFL. He was one of the best corners in the entire league in press man, and he really helped to solidify that 49ers defense on the outside, limiting the passing game. He also is surprisingly one of the best run support corners in the league and one of the best tacklers in all of football with just a 2% missed tackle rate. I can't stress to you how good that statistic is. Most good tackling DBs will have a missed tackle rate that's, I believe the league average this year was somewhere around 7 to 8%. That is amongst top tier corners. The league average is even higher than that. I believe it was around 13 or 14%. But, you'll see a lot of other big names with around that 7 to 8% figure. And Charvarius Ward was at a 2% missed tackle rate. So I believe that Charvarius Ward is the most underrated player in the NFL, at least heading into the 2023 season.
That's a really important thing that I think kind of gets lost is tackling for corners. That is the one thing as a Jet fan. Like I love Sauce Gardner. The one thing that I don't like about his game is he's an arm tackler. He's not really too aggressive with tackles. And obviously tackling is extremely important, and it's an underrated trait to have in a corner. So my most underrated player in the NFL is T. Higgins. He's a guy who's going to be thrown around this offseason all of a sudden now in the trade market, possibly. We'll see what happens with that. But, he came into the league as a rookie, came out strong, 1,000-yard season, a second round pick, a guy that slipped a bit in the NFL draft. And then the Bengals went out and they got Jamar Chase the next year, and now he has to sit in the shadows a little bit of Jamar Chase, just because Chase is such a fantastic player. But this is a guy who'd be a number one receiver on a lot of teams in the NFL, more than half at least. I think he's a top 15 receiver in the NFL. Really, we know about his game: big body, wide frame, one of the best red zone threats in the NFL, like a Mike Williams, go up and catch all these, high ball passes wherever you throw him a goal line fade, you throw him a streak down the sideline, whatever you got to have him do. He's very acrobatic. He's got a great catch radius, and he's got a couple 1,000-yard seasons under his belt. And obviously, everybody knows who T. Higgins is. This isn't some guy that you've never heard of, but like I said, I think he gets sometimes lost in Jamar Chase's shadow. And with all those stars that are on that offense, sometimes we forget to talk about T. Higgins.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that T. Higgins is one of the more underrated players in the NFL. I agree with everything you just said. And I think that, you kind of touched on the fact that he might be on the move this offseason. I think that a lot of people forget that, before A.J. Brown got traded and before Stephon Diggs got traded, they were in a very similar or viewed in a very similar light that T. Higgins is now, in the sense that, most people didn't consider Stephon Diggs a top 5 receiver in the NFL when he was on the Minnesota Vikings. Really, he was playing second fiddle to Adam Thielen there for a while Thielen was getting most of the praise. And then Diggs goes and he becomes a number one target for a very good quarterback. And he also helped to develop Josh Allen, as we know. And now he's considered by most to be that top tier receiver, a top 5 or 6 receiver in the NFL. Same thing with A.J. Brown. A.J. Brown was in a run heavy offense. He was the number one receiver on that team, but, he wasn't really given an opportunity to shine as much as he has with the Philadelphia Eagles. And I agree with that. I think it would not surprise me if T. Higgins goes to another team next year and he becomes that number one guy. And all of a sudden people are viewing him in a similar light to what people view AJ Brown as now. I mean, Higgins, he's a guy that, he runs a 4.4 40. He's a giant. I believe he's 6'4", and he's one of the best receivers in the league in terms of contested catches. He high points the football better than most, if not all, receivers in the NFL. So I think T. Higgins is a great choice by you. I agree with that 100%.
And if I'm T. Higgins, I love being a Bengal, the winning that they've had there. He's been to a Super Bowl and everything. He's got a fantastic quarterback, obviously. But if I'm him, for my own personal sake, you're entering a contract year. He wasn't a first-round pick. There's no fifth-year option for him. So in my fourth year, I'd want to maybe go somewhere else where I could get some more exposure, put up some better numbers, and drive up my market value. I'm sure either way, whenever T. Higgins hits the open market, he'll be a very hot commodity, and he'll have his choosing of teams, and he'll have all the money he could hope for. But I think if he became a number one receiver somewhere else for a year and put up a 12 touchdown season, that he could get even more money.
Yeah, well, we'll have to see if he does end up getting traded this offseason. The Bengals definitely a little bit of a crossroads. All right, so now we'll move on to the most overrated players in the NFL. I believe that the most overrated player in the NFL, where we stand today, there's a lot of guys that you could choose from, but when I made this selection, I think the biggest thing I want to keep in mind is, somebody that gets actively clowned on and everybody calls overrated. Are they really overrated at that point if everybody thinks they're overrated? So one guy that I really never see people criticize, and in fact, I see him get a lot of praise that I believe is very unwarranted. I selected Tampa Bay Buccaneers linebacker Devin White. I remember a few years back when the Green Bay Packers played the Buccaneers in the NFC Championship game. A lot of people were talking about White going into that game, talking about this incredible season that he had and, how are the Packers going to game plan against him? Meanwhile, he had a better teammate standing right next to him on the field in Levante David, who is one of the best linebackers in football. And that was one of the better seasons of Devin White's career, probably the best, that 2020 season. But ever since then, and he wasn't even that great that season. I just want to throw that out there. He was one of the worst pass coverage linebackers in football that year. And in the last two seasons, White has only regressed in basically every single category. Amongst all players this season, amongst all linebackers that played at least 80% of snaps, Devin White had the sixth highest missed tackle rate amongst all linebackers. So you're talking about a guy that's a little bit of a liability when it comes to tackling. And then we're also talking about, like I said, a guy that has consistently been one of the worst pass coverage linebackers, allowing a 103 passer rating in coverage this year as a linebacker. And keep in mind, allowing a 103 passer rating in coverage as a linebacker is kind of hard to do, considering you're rarely giving up deep shots. You're not guarding number one receivers or anything like that. So to be giving up basically, a 103 passer rating is Aaron Rodgers' career passer rating. So any quarterback throwing to him is Aaron Rodgers, basically. And the one thing that Devin White does excel in is he is a very good blitzer. He had the highest pressures amongst all linebackers in the league this year. That's something that I don't want to take away from him, but we're talking about a one-trick pony at the linebacker position. And if you're going to be talked about as one of the best linebackers in football, and a lot of people talk about him in that light, and you are a liability in pass coverage and a liability when it comes to tackling, I don't see how you could be considered one of the best linebackers in football. And for that reason, I have him as the most overrated player in the NFL right now.
Well, we might see him a couple years down the line as, wow, what happened to Devin White? And, people would be a little shocked to see that he kind of fell off the face of the earth, especially, when you pull up those alarming, pass coverage and tackling are the two biggest things for a middle linebacker. Blitzing is the third most important thing. So those are some big things. My overrated player, this is a guy that I personally have been hating on for like a year at least. It's Justin Fields of the Chicago Bears. And obviously there are some things to like about Justin Fields' game that we saw this season. Obviously the legs, the way he can run the ball, put up some phenomenal rushing numbers, almost broke Lamar's record. He probably will next year. Who knows what's going to happen, but this guy as a passer is just awful. Like, I can't emphasize enough how awful he is. He also was the most sacked quarterback in the NFL this year. And usually you'd be like, oh, okay, well, that's his offensive line was bad. This guy just runs into sacks. He holds onto the ball for way too long. He's constantly trying to play hero ball. And I understand that, you got to get him some receivers and some better surrounding talent. I get that. But, Joe, you're an analytics guy. When you look on Football Outsiders at quarterbacks all the qualified quarterbacks, there's 34 of them. And you look at DVOA, DYAR, all these up and coming analytics stats that are being used by these NFL front offices to evaluate players. Justin Fields had a negative 34.5% DVOA, which was last, and it was last by a 12% compared to Matt Ryan of the Colts, who had negative 22.5. Then you look at DYAR, which I was just saying. Again, Matt Ryan, second to last. Justin Fields had negative 541, which is 150 less than Matt Ryan. So, his analytics do not support his game at all. Then you go look at his standard statistics and you look at the way he plays on the field. Very inefficient passer. Still, I think, has turnover problems. And the legs is all he's got going for him right now. And I think if I'm the Bears, I'm not saying, move on from this guy. He's still young. He doesn't have a great supporting cast. He's gone through he's with his second head coach now. They got a lot of cap space, which, we talked about that off camera. Just because you have a lot of cap space, it doesn't mean you're going to have a great team. But go out, try to get some guys on the open market. You have the first overall pick. I'm sure they're going to trade down from that if they're sticking with Justin Fields. Get a haul for that. Build this roster up a little bit and see what he could do. But people are already praising him, and I'm a Jet fan. I see people saying, "Oh my God, well, we should have picked Justin Fields. I can't believe it. Like, we picked Zach Wilson. Zach Wilson sucks too. Don't get me wrong, but Justin Fields is statistically was worse than Zach Wilson this year. Just saying."
Yeah, I mean, we have talked about Fields. I know in a previous segment, me, you, and Merlot did talk to him at length, and we did say that, or talk about him at length, and we did say that, we believe that we don't think the Bears should give up on him. We think that they should build around him. He did show some slight strides, some step forwards this year as a passer. Obviously, once they kind of let him loose as a runner, it really transformed their running game, and there is something to be said about that when you have a quarterback like that could really transform your running game. And he was one of the best runners in the whole league this year, if not the best, Justin Fields, in terms of efficiency. But like you said, I think that he still has a ways to go as a passer. I mean, this is a guy that, he was 28th his rookie year in the composite stat of EPA per play, that's expected points added, and CPOE, which is completion percentage over expected. He was 28th in the NFL his rookie season, and he jumped to 24th in the NFL last season. Now, it's a slight jump, but it's nothing to write home about. We're still talking about a guy, he was below Kenny Pickett in that category. He was right around where Matt Stafford was, who was playing with, a bum elbow and, other injuries. So I agree with you. I think that the problem with Fields is that so many people, I think he's a very likable guy. And a lot of people liked coming out of college. They thought that, he slid down draft boards unjustifiably. And I think that a lot of people have been clinging on to, just something. They want to see some sort of spark from him. And, he's playing very poorly for basically the first year and a half of his career. And then all of a sudden, when the Bears started letting him, let loose in the running game, you saw like a spark, like, wow, you see highlight reels of some of the best runs you'll see from a quarterback. And, that's great. But ultimately, if you're going to be a successful player in this league and you're going to have a nice career and be a franchise quarterback, you need to be able to throw the ball. And he was towards the bottom of the league in basically every stat that you could dream of, whether it be traditional stats or analytics. And he's going to have to take a step forward. I think that, the offensive line was in a better spot this year than it was his rookie season. I think that he had better coaching around him too. But they are going to have to get him better weapons. I mean, we're talking about a receiving core consisting of, Chase Claypool, N'Keal Harry. Darnell Mooney has shown some flashes, but I know he also had some health problems this season. So, they need to build up this receiving core for him, no doubt. But I agree. I mean, I see some people saying things about Justin Fields like he's already there, like he's already proven that he's a star. I see people comparing him to Trevor Lawrence, and there's really no comparison right now. I mean, Lawrence was miles better than him this season, especially as a passer, but even just as an overall player. I mean, Lawrence's passing puts him in a whole different league than Justin Fields this season. And I saw so many Bears fans and Justin Fields supporters after that first half that Trevor Lawrence had against the Chargers. Obviously, we know what happened in the second half in that playoff game, saying, "Oh, but you guys like to say that Trevor Lawrence is better than Fields." I mean, yeah, we do like to say it because it's undeniably true. I don't see the argument for Fields at this point compared to Lawrence. And, I still view Fields as, probably a bottom 12 starter in the NFL. And he's going to have to show serious strides for him to not be overrated. But I agree with you. I think he is one of the more overrated players in the league this year. I think he got way too much praise way too quickly.
Yeah, Lawrence is already on his way to elite territory. I mean, next year, I would not be surprised if we're throwing his name around with Justin Herbert and guys like that.
And I wouldn't be surprised by that either, especially with, Calvin Ridley next season. That's going to be a great addition. We'll see if they make any other moves. And usually, I mean, that's the thing with Fields too. It's that third year for a quarterback. You want to see some strides the second year, but third year is usually the make or break season. Usually that ends up being the true breakout season, and we'll see if that's the case for Fields.
Yep.
All right, so now we'll move on to the NBA. And I'll start off with who I believe is the most underrated player in the NBA this season. And I believe it is Brooklyn Nets big man, Nick Claxton. Nick Claxton is having a phenomenal season. And I see nobody talking about him. We're talking about a guy that is a major plus on both ends of the floor. He has the highest effective field goal percentage and traditional field goal percentage in the NBA this year. He has the highest block rate on the defensive side of the floor, and the rest of the defensive metrics really support him being a well above average player on that side of the floor. Overall value, a guy with 5.9 win shares. I mean, if you put up a 6 win share season overall, I mean, that's a very good season. That puts you in all-star territory. But 5.9 win shares, at this point in the season, we're not even at the all-star break year yet, is very impressive. And then 1.8 VORP, which is value over replacement player. That puts him in the same sort of category as Zion Williamson, Trae Young, Anthony Edwards. That's a lot of guys that, are considered stars in this league. And, Anthony Edwards is, getting a lot of praise this year. So to me, Nick Claxton has been nothing but a positive for the Nets this year and really is a big reason for their success. Although we'll see where that success is going to go now with the possible trading of Kyrie Irving. But, this is a player that I don't think gets nearly enough praise. And I think people should start taking more of a look at Nick Claxton.
All right. My most underrated player in the NBA is the big man on the Milwaukee Bucks. I'm going with Bobby Portis. He's a guy who's been in the league for a long time now. He's bounced around with his fair share of teams. He was on that Bucks championship team a couple of years ago, and he's really blossomed as a player in their system, and he's only getting better. So, he's averaging a double-double this year. His standard statistics are very good. He's averaging 14 points and 10 rebounds. And when you look, that's also in 26.8 minutes per game. When you look at his PI rating, which is a player impact estimate, it's basically just a measure of their all-around contribution to the game, basically like WAR, the version of WAR from baseball. He's 39th in the league. He's right in between Christian Wood and Kyrie Irving. He's in front of Kyrie Irving, Devin Booker, Vucevic, DeAndre Ayton. These are some really, really big names. And there's not really anything that is subjective to that. Everybody's got around the same amount of games played. There's nothing really fishy going on about that statistic. So the fact that he's got that supporting him, Bobby Portis is not a guy that people would ever think considering to be a top 50 player in the NBA. And when you look at these numbers, I think he deserves to be in the conversation.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think that especially, Knicks fans,
God, yeah.
Bobby Portis is almost like a meme.
Yeah, literally.
New York, and yet he's been such a huge contributor to the Bucks' success. And I think that that's a great pick. I agree. I think that he's one of the more underrated players in the league at this point. And it's crazy because it's not like he's a young player, but he really has blossomed the last couple of seasons, especially this year. And I think that that's a great pick. I like that pick.
That's the thing about the NBA that is so crazy compared to all the other sports. Bobby Portis, I guess the only one you could talk about is soccer, but that's, we're just talking about the American ones right now. Bobby Portis is 27 years old. In football, in baseball, especially in baseball, 27 is young. Like, wow, that's really young. In basketball, we're like, Bobby Portis has been in the league since 2015. You immediately in your head just think, oh, he's on the back end of his career. Guy's 27, so he could be hitting his prime right now.
Okay, so I'm going to move into who I believe is the most overrated player in the NBA, and he's been in the league for a couple seasons now. And a lot of people were starting to kind of talk about him in the same breath as some stars. And he's on a very good team. And he's been in the news a lot recently for the wrong reasons. And that is Dylan Brooks. A lot of people, like I said, have been clowning on Brooks recently because of, personality and off the court things more so than his play on the court. I just want to say this. Dillon Brooks has got to be one of the biggest enigmas in the NBA. We're talking about the second option on a really good team, a team that could be a championship contender. Obviously he plays second fiddle to John Morant, but yet a guy with his usage percentage and takes the amount of shots that he does, he's a high volume shooter, is one of the most inefficient players in the entire NBA. We're talking about a guy that has a 49 true shooting percentage in Dillon Brooks. The league average this season is 58%. He shoots below average from basically everywhere on the court. He's about a 31% three-point shooter. And he really doesn't excel at anything. And really, one thing that really blows my mind about him is that he takes so many of these threes and he shoots so poorly because if you watch him, it seems that he changes his shot basically on a nightly basis. Sometimes he'll have a little hitch in his shot. Sometimes it'll be really smooth, and those are the ones that go in. If he has a guy in his face, he has a completely different shot. He almost looks like he's pushing the ball sometimes. So to me, I'm thinking, you're the Memphis Grizzlies. You have the chance to compete for a championship. Why are you giving this guy so many shots? Why is he being used the way that he is? To me, it's almost malpractice. A guy that is this inefficient of a shooter. I mean, not only an inefficient shooter, just an overall really negative impact player. We're talking about a guy that has 1 win share on the season, okay? That puts him in the same breath as Dario Saric, Maxi Kleber, Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Obi Toppin, guys that play significantly less minutes than him or are considered, scrubs in this league. And this is a guy that has accumulated 1 win share. I mean, it's mind-blowing to me, still the amount of touches that he gets in a game. A guy that has a negative 0.9 VORP, value over respected player, a replacement player. That you're talking about a guy, like I said, that's a negative impact. A replacement player would be, we were talking about the WAR equivalent in the NBA. This is really the WAR equivalent in the NBA, and he's a negative impact on the court. Another statistic I'll throw out there just to show how incredibly inefficient he is as a scorer, and along with his volume, points added by overall shooting. He is at negative 138. That is horrible. Again, I don't understand why this guy is ever mentioned in the same breath as some all-stars. He's probably the worst scorer in the league when you talk about volume. There is no other player that takes his volume of shots and is so inefficient. It amazes me that the Grizzlies still allow him to have this type of green light. I think Dillon Brooks is the most overrated player in the NBA where we stand today.
I think Shannon Sharp will be pretty happy with that pick if you asked him. My pick for the most overrated player in the NBA. I don't know if it'll be a shock to some people. I don't think it is. This is a guy who I think is pretty controversial. You either really support him or you really clown on him. It's Devin Booker. And, he's had some success in his young career. Obviously, getting to the finals is a big deal. And I think Devin Booker is a good player. And, I'd want him on my team. I'm always seeing stuff on Twitter like, who would you rather have, this player, that player? He's getting thrown around pretty recently with the likes of Jason Tatum and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. I don't think Devin Booker, especially with Jason Tatum, I mean, I don't think he deserves to be spoken in the same sentence as those guys. I'll bring up the numbers to back it up. You look at win shares, what you were talking about. I had to do per 48 minutes just because Booker's, had the disadvantage of games played a little bit this year. He is 35th in the NBA in win shares per 48. Respectable position, right behind Brunson, Randall, Malcolm Brogdon, DeMar DeRozan. He's no slouch, but he's not a top 20 player in the NBA. And I think a lot of people consider him to be, and I don't think he deserves that recognition. I don't know if he deserves the superstar tag. I think that's something that gets thrown around a little bit too much. I wouldn't myself call him a superstar. When I was talking before about the player impact estimate about Bobby Portis, he's behind Bobby Portis. He's 41st in the NBA. And that's behind, like I said, Christian Wood, Bam Adebayo, Julius Randle's there again. So Devin Booker is a guy who is certainly an above average player. Is he a all-star every season type of player? Possibly. Is he an MVP candidate, a guy who's going to be projected to be a Hall of Famer? I personally do not think so. And if I was building a team, he wouldn't necessarily be at the top of my list.
I agree with that. I think that that was a good point that you made that, he's obviously a great player, but he is a lot of times mentioned in the same breath as guys like Shea Gilgeous-Alexander, Jason Tatum. Even I think that the guy that, a big debate that was going on for a couple of years was him and Donovan Mitchell. And Mitchell, especially this season, has just, there's really no comparison between the two of them. Mitchell has taken another step forward and, has become one of the better players in the NBA now. And Booker is just not on that level. So I agree that Booker, that's a good pick. I think that he does get a little overrated. All right, now we'll move on to the MLB. And I'll start off with my selection for the most underrated player in baseball. And I went with Nico Hoerner, who was the shortstop for the Chicago Cubs next year. He projects to play second base for them this season after their addition of Dansby Swanson, who will now slide over and play shortstop for them. So let's get one thing straight. Nico Hoerner is not an underrated offensive player. This is a guy that, chases too much, swings and misses too much. You take a look at his baseball savant page, you're going to see a lot of blue. There's a lot of things not to like on the offensive side of the ball. He has a low walk rate. But a lot of times when I look at young players, right, and I want to see how could we project them going forward. I mean, there's the obvious of looking at expected stats, and maybe a guy was unlucky, and in the future, if they're hitting the ball hard, you would think that they'll have it'll pay off at some point. That's not the case for Nico Hoerner. But one thing that I do like about Nico Hoerner, and again, a thing that I look for in young players, is I think that one thing that is correctable for a guy that's 25 like him is plate discipline. I think that plate discipline is one of those things that as a player gets older is something that, whether it be, off-season work or a new hitting coach or just experience, it's one of those things that's certainly correctable. And I think that he could end up being at least a league average hitter at shortstop consistently. And maybe even an above average hitter because he's very athletic. He does have a little pop in his bat. And I think that if he did get that walk rate up a little bit and that strikeout rate down a bit, I think that he could be a player that's a plus on that side of the ball for years to come.
Yeah, well, he could be on the Francisco Lindor type of path. And, Lindor did it a little bit differently. He came out and was a fantastic offensive player right off the bat. But, Lindor's a guy who he puts up an 850 OPS. He's an MVP. He's so good defensively. And obviously, probably the most premier defensive position in the entire game. That center field or catcher, it's always a debate. But he makes his money with his glove, and you're right, he's a great player.
Yeah, his glove is. I mean, we're talking about a guy that he was 98th percentile in the league last year. And now it's above average. I mean, this is one of the better defenders in the league. I can't see a reason why he won't be one of the best defensive second basemen next year. You would think that his value would be highest at shortstop, but, the Cubs did make the decision to go out and get Dansby Swanson, who is a great player and had the best season of his career last year. So I think the Cubs are starting to build kind of a young foundation up the middle in the infield. And, Hoerner, I think, is a great building block, and I don't think he gets, nearly the praise that he should. He was fantastic last year.
Okay, my pick for the most underrated player in baseball is a guy who everybody knows who he is now. He came onto the scene last year as a rookie and had a phenomenal season. He was actually overshadowed a little bit by his teammate, and that's Spencer Strider. And the guy I'm talking about being overshadowed by, of course, is Michael Harris, who ended up winning the NL Rookie of the Year. But Spencer Strider is certainly, in my opinion, a top 10 pitcher in baseball already. And when me and Merlot continue our top 10 at each position segment, he will certainly be on my list. It's just a matter of how high I will have him. And I'll tell you why I'm already saying that. Obviously, when you look at some of the standard statistics, 2.77 ERA is phenomenal. The strikeout numbers are insane. And let me just go over how insane these strikeout numbers really are. When you sort by K per nine, and you look at the starting pitchers only, not only is Spencer Strider the number one pitcher in baseball in terms of strikeouts per 9 innings, it's by 1.8 strikeouts per 9 innings, which he is putting up reliever-esque strikeout numbers, which is absolutely insane. It's a 13.84 strikeout per 9. And like I said, that is by far the best in baseball. Then when you want to sort by FIP, which is fielding independent pitching, again, not only is he number one in baseball amongst all pitchers with at least 100 innings pitched, he is at a 1.92 FIP. The next best one was newly signed Yankees pitcher Carlos Rodon, who had a 2.25. So 202 strikeouts in 131 innings, sub one whip, sub 3 ERA. There is nothing that you can't love about this guy. I think he's probably going to be my Cy Young pick in the NL this year. I'm sure that these numbers I mean, I'm not sure. Maybe they'll come back down to earth a little bit in terms of the strikeouts and everything like that, but his stuff is just absolutely disgusting. And I'll tell you, the Braves, their young core of players is just out of this world at this point.
Yeah, I love that pick of Spencer Strider. I had made a TikTok actually about him. I believe it was last September during the season, saying how he really had been the most dominant pitcher in the sport. And obviously, he wasn't going to win the Cy Young, and he didn't even win the Rookie of the Year because he ended up getting hurt in September, and he wasn't up the whole year, so he didn't have the innings. Like you said, he only pitched, you said, about 130 innings, correct?
Yep.
And, you're not going to win any awards or even be considered the best pitcher in baseball when you do that. But when he was on the mound, he was the best pitcher in baseball last year. He was the most dominant pitcher. He was overwhelming batters with his ridiculous stuff. And I think that that's a great pick. And honestly, I could definitely get behind that Cy Young pick for next year.
Yeah. And that duo, there's some great starting pitching duos in the league. Of course, you have Verlander and Scherzer. You got Cole and Rodon. That duo of Fried and Strider could trump all of them this year. It is filthy.
I could definitely see that.
And it's two guys who are very different. You got righty, lefty. You got contact pitcher, weak contact pitcher versus strikeout pitcher. They got a ridiculous team.
They really do. All right, so we'll move on to who I believe now is the most overrated player in baseball where we stand today. This is a guy coming off of a bad season for the Boston Red Sox, and that's outfielder Alex Verdugo. Now, I don't think most people consider Alex Verdugo a superstar by any stretch of the imagination, but I still think people give him a little bit too much credit. And the reason why I'm saying that is that especially this offseason, I've seen a lot of people talk about reflecting on the Red Sox past couple of years. Obviously a lot of people have been very critical of the way that they've handled their star players. Xander Bogaerts, now San Diego Padre, and then there was obviously the Mookie Betts trade a couple of years ago to the Dodgers. And, a lot of people have been clowning on, obviously, the fact that the best prospect that they got back was Jeter Downs, who has now been DFA'd, which even took me by surprise. But, I've still seen some people, especially Red Sox fans, saying, well, at least we got Verdugo back in the trade. And if your sigh of relief, if the saving grace of that trade is Alex Verdugo, who is at best a league average outfielder, is crazy to me because, you look at this past season, a 1.2 F-WAR. That's basically a replacement level player. One of the worst players in all of the MLB in terms of guys who are qualified when we're talking about WAR. A guy that offered very little on the offensive side of the ball. And then also a guy on the defensive side of the ball that was in the 13th percentile in outs above average. This is a guy that is not contributing positively on either side of the ball, and yet people still talk about him like, I don't think anybody, like I said, considers him to really be a star, but even to consider him to be a good above average player in a lineup. I mean, I've even seen some people talking about the Red Sox lineup this season. They're like, well, you got Verdugo in there. Obviously, yeah, you have Rafael Devers is the big bat in there, but then people talk about Verdugo in almost the same breath, and it's like, I don't view that as a positive in your lineup. I view that almost as a whole because Verdugo, I mean, he's still a young player, but he hasn't really shown much, even as a young player in Boston. He's been there for 3 seasons now. So he's not a guy that I like projecting going forward, and I think that he gets way too much praise for what he is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that was certainly a poor trade for the Red Sox, and Verdugo certainly has not panned out to be what they had hoped for him to be. So my pick for the most overrated player in baseball, there's a couple guys I was thinking about. We were talking about off air. I was thinking about Lance McCullers, but I ended up going with Rhys Hoskins, and my justification for Rhys Hoskins is he's actually coming off the worst season of his career. Just about. That or 2019. It's a toss-up. But he's really coming off the worst year of his career. And it's being overshadowed by the excitement around the Phillies, the run that they had, his heroics in the playoffs. And like we've been saying about some of our overrated players, don't get me wrong. Rhys Hoskins is an above average player in baseball. He's not a bad baseball player by any means. However, he's certainly not a top 10 first baseman. And I was actually looking at some lists on Twitter of, I follow a lot of people who make lists and everything. And a lot of them had Rhys Hoskins in their top 10. And when I made my list, I didn't even consider him, to be honest with you. He was outside the top 10 in F WAR for first baseman. He was outside the top 10 in WRC plus. He's one of the worst defensive first basemen that are in the sport. Granted, it's one of the least important positions in terms of defense, but still, that does have something to do with it. Yeah, I mean, 30 home runs last year, a nice season for him. But when you look at all the other numbers, 246 average, a 332 on base, you'd like to see that a little bit higher. 794 OPS, 122 OPS plus. These are above average numbers. The 794 OPS and obviously the 122 OPS plus, considering the league average is 100, that is an above average number. But when you take into consideration that he is a first baseman, which is, normally a very productive offensive position, and you take into account his defense, even his base running, he's one of the least efficient base runners at the first baseman position. That's why I think that Rhys Hoskins does not deserve top 10 first baseman consideration. And honestly, he's been overrated over the course of his career because he had sort of a Gary Sanchez type of introduction to baseball where he was on this tear, hitting home runs left and right. And we really projected him to become a superstar. And he really hasn't turned out to be that player.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And I think that a huge reason why he's kind of fallen into this category of overrated recently is because he had a couple of clutch hits in the postseason. He had that big home run. And I think that this happens every single season. There's always somebody, at least one player in the postseason that has a great postseason or has a couple of, huge hits. And they just get way more credit overall than they should. Obviously, you should get credit for being clutch in the playoffs. But to then, they had that fan list on MLB Network for top shortstops. And I believe Jeremy Pena was like fourth or something like that. And he's not a top 10 shortstop in baseball where we stand today. We're talking about a guy that had less than a 300 on base percentage in the regular season. And honestly, I was even considering doing Jeremy Pena. And the reason why I bring him up is because he was the World Series MVP. I was considering doing Jeremy Pena for my most overrated player, but I do really like Jeremy Pena projecting moving forward. So I did not select him for that reason. He is a great defensive shortstop, and he's obviously very young. And last year was his rookie season, so for that reason, I didn't pick him. But my point being that a lot of guys just get way too much credit for these postseason. It's very rare.
Rosarena.
Oh yeah, I mean Randy Rosarena, like Steve Pearce a couple of years ago, Eric Hosmer, all those years ago for the Royals that really earned him that huge contract with the Padres. It's very rare that a guy will have a huge postseason and then it translates into them it being like this turning point for their career. I mean, the one guy that I can think of is Daniel Murphy, had that incredible run for the Mets, and then he signs with the Nationals, and he ended up being an MVP candidate that next season. He was one of the best hitters in baseball. But that really is an anomaly, and it doesn't happen a whole lot. And I agree. Rhys Hoskins, at this point, he is what he is, and a couple of clutch hits in the postseason does not change the way that I perceive him at all. I agree. He's not a top 10 first baseman in baseball, and he's getting way too much credit this offseason.